In this video, we're going to go through motion, how the subject's moving in front of the camera, and how the intervals and the shutter speed you choose really affect that motion. Little things like people on foot versus bicycle, cars versus clouds building, each of those have a different rate of motion, and that interval and the shutter speed will affect the story that you're trying to tell. Once you kind of know how those work, it's a lot easier to really utilize that to your advantage. Today we're going to head into the historic center of Mexico City, and we're going to walk around and see some of the way that motion's playing out in front of us between people crossing streets, bicycles moving, cars driving around, and how all of that at different shutter speeds and different intervals will affect your video. We're going to go meet up with a woman named Natalia that runs a program called Walking Through History to learn a little bit more about the area here, and maybe we'll be able to find some really cool motion to play off to run a time lapse. Okay. Now, why is the Centro Histórico here such a special place in Mexico City?
First of all, because it mashes all different moments in history in Mexico. Here you can find all the history of 500 years.
Mexico City is so rich in culture, in art, in history that it really offers a ton to me. You have incredibly nice people that are really willing to show you their culture. Got a lot of motion going on here. We've got people moving, people not moving. I might try to find a little bit elevated of an area that I can do a time lapse, maybe even a few time lapses to shoot some varying rates of motion to see how this plays out in front of the camera. Now, before you can even approach your time lapse, there's a few things that you have to ask yourself. What is your main subject? If the clouds are your main subject and they're building slowly, you have to choose a very different interval than if people moving in front of that camera are your subject. The other thing you really have to think about is how long you have to invest in this. If it's something like shadows moving across the field, that could be a 5 or 6 hour investment that you're sitting there taking a time lapse. If it's something like a street scene, you might be there for just a couple minutes. I think this should work. We have a pretty elevated view so I can see people. There's others sitting down, and the cross streets with cars every now and then I have a little view of, so I think we should be pretty good here. Let's give it a try. All right, well, I think I have a pretty good setup, but before I really invest time in this, I'm going to take a test exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and shoot. And on my review, I can see that my histogram, I'm not really losing any blacks. The only part losing a little detail is the sky itself. So my subject matter, the ground here, is well exposed. I think I'm ready to start this time lapse. So in this example, we're at a 60th of a second, and you can really see the motion is kind of choppy from everything. People are almost frozen in place, but really this causes a very sharp staccato motion. I'm going to go to an 1/8 second, and now we're going to get a little bit more motion out of the people and a little more whoosh. That's going to give them that impression of motion, and you're going to see a little more smoothness overall from this. Let's take that 1/8 second down to a 1/2 second. Now we've got a 1 second interval and a 1/2 second exposure. This is something called the 180 rule, often commonly used in video. This gives you a very smooth look to the motion. So if it's a 1 second exposure and I have a 2 second interval, you have a very clean, smooth look to that video. Now let's take that interval and go to 2 seconds and take our shutter speed and go to 1 second. You see this motion looks like it's moved much faster through. We've got our calliope player here, and now this is a 4 second long interval with a 2 second exposure. People are blowing by him. The ones that just stop to give him a little tip, you see only for a brief second. Now, not only do we have the motion playing out in front, our shutter speed, and that interval, but we have to consider how we're going to play this video back. All of the examples we're looking at in this are 24 frames per second. The reason we're using that is it's considered the cinematic standard. When you watch a movie, it's usually filmed at 24 frames per second, so to most people that kind of looks natural. So if I'm shooting 24 frames per second, I need 24 pictures to make 1 second of video. So if I need a 10-second video, we're going to need 240 frames or pictures to create that 10-second video. If I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, I would need 300 pictures for that same 10-second video. So far we've talked about the gear, we've talked about the camera settings, we've talked about how your motion of subject is playing out in front of it and your intervals. Now let's take this to a whole new level and move the camera through to three-dimensional space. We're going to start talking about motion control.